So just to kind of give us a bigger context for the overall discussion and briefings that you all have been getting, where we've been and where we're going with nuclear arms control, why it matters, and what is next. For decades, leaders in Washington, Moscow, and other capitals have come to understand the catastrophic consequences of nuclear war, and if it breaks out, that it threatens every person on the planet. And they have generally understood and agreed that they've got to work together some way, somehow, against the spread of nuclear weapons and against the spread of nuclear weapons technologies, and to prevent the ultimate catastrophe. And 60 years ago tomorrow, JFK captured the dilemma very well in his and the dilemma and the fundamental solutions in his immortal 1963 address at American University. This is just a portion of those remarks, and those remarks have echoed through time, and we're hearing echoes of his warning of the dangers and his strategy for peace, as he called the speech then, going forward even to this day. So, ever since then, and even before then, the leaders of the major nuclear armed states, and there are now more than there were in 1963, and most non-nuclear weapon states agree that it is in their mutual interest and the global interest to prevent nuclear war, head off dangerous nuclear arms competition, curb the spread of nuclear weapons. And although there's less agreement about this point, many believe that in order to eliminate the threat of nuclear weapons must be eliminated, while others with nuclear weapons, at the very least, acknowledge they should seek to make progress towards the goal of a world free of nuclear weapons at some point. And based upon my experience in this field, which goes back to, frankly, my teen years and my professional time here in Washington, it's quite clear that when, and almost only when, political leaders, particularly U.S. leaders, are under pressure from their publics and various elements of the nuclear arms control and disarmament movement, do they respond, and do they move to address the threats in significant ways? And so over the years, we have seen the development of a very important, imperfect, but interrelated set of agreements that have, for the most part, successfully reduced the dangers posed by nuclear weapons. And this is an alphabet soup of acronyms and treaties, but there is, I think, an important lesson here, which is that this is a process that has been decades in the making. Today we're at the point, and I'll get to this later, where much of this is unraveling, much of this is gone, and the future is less certain. So shortly after the Kennedy speech in '63, we saw breakthroughs. This is even before the Cuban Missile Crisis, the resumption of the dialogue, the establishment of a hotline agreement, the limited test ban treaty. Other non-nuclear weapon states responded too. We can't forget the nuclear weapons free zone treaties that have been established, beginning with the Latin American zone in '67, the NPT in '68, and then a series of agreements between the US and the Soviets to reduce, or I should say to limit first, and later to reduce their stockpiles, the SALT agreements, the START agreements, and just as importantly, their limits on defensive strategic weapons as expressed in the 1972 ABM treaty. There are other reinforcing mechanisms here. The Nuclear Suppliers Group, which voluntarily limits the spread of nuclear weapons-related technologies, enrichment and reprocessing technologies, the Missile Technology Control Regime. And then in the 90s, we saw, of course, a flurry of breakthroughs with the end of the Cold War. beginning with things that are not technically arms control treaties, things like the US-Soviet presidential initiatives, which drew back enormous numbers of sub-strategic nuclear weapons from Soviet and American naval vessels and withdrawn into their territories as the Soviet Union was breaking up. We saw the Soviet Union declaring a nuclear test moratorium, the United States Congress responding first, and then the United States putting in force a moratorium that has lasted to this day, and all of that leading to the negotiation of the CTBT in 1996. But we have clearly come full circle because we have a new set of problems today. As we enter 2023, or the second half of 2023, the enterprise, the global disarmament and non-proliferation enterprise, is under severe stress. There is widespread agreement among experts and leaders that the dangers that we see today are higher than we've seen since the end of the Cold War, and the norms and agreements that have been established over the decades, the guardrails against disaster, are under severe stress. Or as Jake Sullivan put it just a week ago at our annual meeting, over the last few years, the foundation has begun to erode. So, why is that? This is about more than just Russia's war in Ukraine. We have not seen progress on nuclear risk reduction and disarmament in over a decade between the US and Russia. But Russia's war and its not so veiled threats of nuclear weapons have clearly heightened the risk of nuclear conflict and challenged the fundamental taboos against nuclear use, threats of use. And I think it is also made clear to many countries, especially non-nuclear weapon states, the unsustainability of policies that depend on the threat of nuclear use, deterrence policies to deter, to coerce, and to threaten others, as Russia has done and as other nuclear armed states do in more discrete ways. So the most worrisome impact of all, I think, at the moment is the impact that the war has produced on trying to achieve further progress on disarmament, which undergirds this entire global system. I mean, you've heard about the NPT treaty, you've heard about the TPNW. I think the frustrations about the non-nuclear weapon states about the failure to fulfill the bargain in 1995 at the NPT Extension Conference to make good on the disarmament pillar of the NPT. The future of nuclear disarmament efforts, which has been at a standstill, as I said, for the past decade, is under even greater jeopardy. The other thing that the war and the standstill and disarmament is doing is we have non-nuclear weapon states, especially the states that have subscribed to the TPNW, solidifying their view that nuclear weapons and nuclear threats of any kind are illegal and immoral instruments of power, that nuclear weapons have to be abolished as soon as possible, and that we're living on borrowed time. And there's increasing frustration on their end about the lack of progress. And this is going to create increased stress and strain on the broader non-proliferation and disarmament enterprise. So, then finally, we have the possibility of a three-way nuclear arms race without renewed nuclear arms control diplomacy between the United States and Russia, and at some point involving China, the UK, and France. It is quite possible that we're going to see for the first time in over 30 years an increase, not a decrease, in the overall size of the nuclear arsenals of the major nuclear powers, and the start of a new and costly and more dangerous arms race. So in the brief time I've got, and I do want to get to your questions or observations, I want to offer a couple of reflections about a couple of things. Why did Jake Sullivan put it at the conference that Arms Control Foundation is eroding? What's at stake, and what can be done to rejuvenate the arms control and disarmament diplomacy enterprise in the decade ahead? And then, if we got a little bit of time, I wanted to briefly reflect on something that's important to all reporting and all analysis of the nuclear weapons challenge, which is the contradictions and tensions between nuclear deterrence strategy and our disarmament ambitions and obligations, and how this manifests itself in different ways as global leaders try to manage the nuclear threat. So how fragile is the foundation exactly? This is the same list I showed you before, but I have color-coded it to just indicate where some of the cracks in the foundation actually are. So in orange, you'll see agreements that have been overtaken by events or caveats on some of the successes of the past. In red, you'll see things that no longer exist or will soon no longer exist. And so, if you look at this and just take a glance at this, what you basically see is that without further US-Russian nuclear arms control negotiations, we may not have one of the key pillars in this architecture, agreements limiting the world's two largest nuclear arsenals. New START is going to be expiring in under 1,000 days. What we also have left are nuclear weapons free zone treaties, which are vitally important, but they reinforce the non-nuclear status of states in the non-nuclear regions around the world. The CTBT is still there, although it has not entered into force. The nuclear test moratorium, which the CTB helped establish, is actually working. This is one of the most, I think, effective multilateral non-proliferation and disarmament agreements ever. But we can't take the CTB for granted because, of course, we may have North Korea testing nuclear weapons. We may have future concerns about the compliance with the CTBT by nuclear armed states. Right now, the United States has accused Russia of engaging in activities that are inconsistent with the zero-yield CTBT. And then, as I said before, the NPT was extended in 1995 on the promise that certain elements of the NPT bargain would be fulfilled. And it is generally non-nuclear weapon state majority believes, and I tend to agree with them, that key nuclear disarmament commitments that were made at the time have not been fulfilled. And so there is a severe tension within the NPT system about that lack of progress. And then, of course, we have the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, which exists. It has entered into force. It has changed the conversation about nuclear weapons. It has reinforced the taboos against nuclear weapons in important ways, but it, at the moment, is not having much effect on moving the nuclear weapon states to take risk reduction measures and to reduce arsenals and to avoid a nuclear arms race. So the situation is extremely fragile. And the one thing I want to emphasize, I'm going to come to, is what I think is one of the most severe problems, which is the item at the bottom of this list, which is that the New START treaty expires on February 5, 2026. At the moment, there are no active talks between the United States and Russia on risk reduction or what might follow New START. That was all upset by the Russian decision to invade Ukraine. That led the United States to cut off the strategic stability dialogue that had been resumed in 2021. It exacerbated tensions over implementation of New START, and now Russia, of course, has suspended its implementation of New START, but it has continues to say that it will meet the central limits of the treaty. And then, of course, compounding all of this, you talked about this, I'm sure, earlier in your session, is the potentially large buildup of China's now comparatively smaller nuclear force, which is going to complicate how the United States and Russia seek to manage their own bilateral competition. So we're experiencing, as Yogi Berra would say, the great baseball philosopher, deja vu all over again. And we are hearing some of the same warnings from people like Joe Biden, the UN Secretary General, as we heard from John F. Kennedy 60 years ago. We are facing in many ways some of the same kinds of challenges that Kennedy and Khrushchev and the world faced in 1963, though with a lot more experience under our belts and appreciation for what can be accomplished. But there is a glimmer of hope. And so let me talk about some of what the current situation is and what the path forward is from the perspective of my organization and many other organizations who are working in the nuclear arms control and disarmament field. So last week at our Arms Control Association forum, Jake Sullivan said some other things aside from the fact that the foundation of nuclear arms control is eroding. He said that it is, let me find his, where did it go? Here it is. Well, there's Jake, but I don't have these quotes up. All right. So he said it is neither in the United States nor Russia's interest to embark on an open-ended competition in strategic nuclear forces, and that the United States is prepared to stick to the central limits of New START as long as Russia does. And he also said, rather than waiting to resolve all of our bilateral differences, the United States is ready to engage Russia now to manage nuclear risks and develop a post-2026 arms control framework. We are prepared to enter into those discussions. So this is a bit of a shift away from the United States, emphasis on urging Russia to meet its New START obligations, to return to talks about resuming on-site inspections that were suspended because of the pandemic, to provide the data exchanges on nuclear forces that the treaty requires. This is an emphasis on what happens after New START and a recognition that Russia for now is meeting these obligations, and the most important next thing for US-Russian arms control and strategic stability is working out a new arrangement to supersede New START. Now, in something of a surprise, just a few days later, on June 5th, the Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov said Russia remains open to dialogue with the US on arms control. He described Sullivan's statement that the US is ready for dialogue with Russia on arms control as, quote, important and positive, unquote. You don't hear that from the Russians very often. But he said Russia wants to understand more about the proposal through formal diplomatic channels, which is understandable. This was a speech at the National Press Club. So I'm told by my sources at the White House, the NSC, that a formal diplomatic communication from the White House is forthcoming. So we shall see how this, what I think is a small diplomatic window of opportunity, works out. And I think it may be a very important opportunity given how little time is left and how difficult relations are between the US and Russia over the war. Now, the other thing that was important, and that relates to one of the things up here on the screen, another element of the formula for success, is that Sullivan said the United States is willing to engage in new multilateral arms control efforts, including through the 5 permanent members of the Security Council, the US, China, Russia, the UK, France. And he said, we're under no illusions that reaching risk reduction and arms control measures in that setting will be easy, but we do believe it is possible, unquote. So, what does this mean? There has been a P5 process underway off and on for the last decade, mainly at the experts level, to exchange information about nuclear policies, nuclear definitions. It's been a forum that has met a couple times a year. It's been suspended briefly at times. Right now, it's only operating at the expert level. But this is the only place where the United States and China and Russia and the other nuclear armed members of the NPT get together. I don't know exactly what the administration has in mind in terms of elevating the dialogue. Sullivan's speech did outline some of the things that he thinks that the P5 might agree to, mainly with respect to risk reduction. But this could be more fruitful than continuing to bang away at Beijing about a bilateral nuclear risk reduction arms control dialogue, which China has thus far refused, going back to the Trump administration. China has always favored the P5 approach. And then at the same time, Russia has complained for years that the UK and France must be engaged in, or at least factored into, the dialogue on nuclear arms control and disarmament. So, this P5 approach might provide more opportunity, especially in my view, if the discussion is elevated from the expert level to the political level, and the level of ambition in the discussions is raised a bit from what they've been focused on. The other thing that's important about this from a non-nuclear weapon state perspective is that we've got to remember all 5 of the NPT nuclear armed countries have Article 6 disarmament responsibilities. Most fundamentally, they're all obligated to pursue negotiations in good faith on effective measures relating to the cessation of the nuclear arms race at an early date. That's not just the US and Russia, that's also China. And so I think this shift in emphasis by the United States might, and I hope, earn the United States a bit more support from some of the non-nuclear weapon states, especially in the context of the NPT, and that might in turn put some more pressure on China and Russia to productively engage in the P5 process. So, beyond that, one of the things that we and several of our non-governmental expert colleagues are thinking about and pushing for as a next phase, and this may be too ambitious for some of the P5 governments, is a global nuclear freeze. Given that the Chinese are increasing their stockpile, given that the British and the French have relatively small arsenals but are not planning to increase, given that Russia and the United States would rather stay within the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty numerical limits, a good way perhaps to ease the tensions, to halt the potential of a nuclear arms race, is to call for and abide by a global nuclear freeze in which China, France, and the United Kingdom would freeze the size of their arsenals as long as the US and Russia continue to engage in good faith negotiations. So, these are some of the ideas that we think are important. The ideas on this list here on the slide are also things that the Biden administration has recently spoken about and elevated and made clear is a priority for them, which we see as extremely positive. Other elements, going forward, and I'm not going to talk too much about this now. There has been historically a push for reducing the role and salience of nuclear weapons and nuclear deterrence. What are we talking about here? This is narrowing the role of nuclear weapons further and further, ideally to the sole purpose of nuclear weapons being only to retaliate to nuclear use and not for first use. Various ways to reinforce the taboos against nuclear use, of course, nuclear threats and nuclear testing. And then also, as the TPNW states parties have shown, it will continue to be important, not just by non-nuclear weapon states, but also nuclear weapon states, to keep in mind what the catastrophic consequences of nuclear use could be, and to build on the statement that the P5 issued a year and a half ago, that reissued, I should say, that a nuclear war cannot be won and must never be fought. So let me just say a couple words about, and of course, Prime Minister Kishida at the G7 also made the point by going to Hiroshima that conveying the reality of a nuclear attack is an important starting point for all nuclear disarmament efforts. So that's another point there on the catastrophic consequences, part of the solution. So let me say a couple things about the conflict between nuclear deterrence and disarmament. And then I'll wrap up and we can have some questions, and I can let you guys go off to lunch. I realize I'm keeping you from your lunch. So, as many of the non-nuclear weapon states have been pointing out in recent years, and this is a quote from Alexander Clement, who's one of the architects of the TPNW. He also spoke at our annual meeting last week. He pointed out very cogently and succinctly, there is a tension between nuclear deterrence policies and the ability of the international community to reject nuclear weapons as instruments of policy. And so the general approach of the nuclear weapon states is simply to manage the status quo and to prevent measures that would actually demonstrate a readiness to move away from nuclear weapons and to make real progress on achieving nuclear disarmament. So we see this tension play out in all sorts of ways, but this is not often, I think, reflected in the public discourse, not especially much in the reporting on these issues, but this is an important component that I think many ordinary people can understand if this is reflected in the reporting that we do and the presentations that we do about these issues. Let me just give you one example of this that has occurred quite recently, this tension between the two. And we see this in the reactions to President Putin's not so veiled threats of nuclear weapons use in 2022. You'll note that in November, the group of 20 states at the Bali summit issued a very simple statement about the threats of nuclear weapons use. They said, quote, nuclear weapons use and threats of use are inadmissible, period. This was a statement put together by non-nuclear weapon states. Indonesia, which is a leading TPNW state party, had the pen. It was a compromise between nuclear and non-nuclear weapon states. However, when the G7 leaders had the chance to speak about this at the May summit in Hiroshima, they chose to condemn nuclear use and threats of use in a different way, only by Russia and only in relation to its war on Ukraine. And in their iteration, the G7 declared that, quote, threats by Russia of nuclear weapons use, let alone any use of nuclear weapons by Russia in the context of its aggression against Ukraine, are inadmissible. So it was meant to sound like the G20, but there's an important caveat, and that is the result of the fact that the G7, which includes 3 nuclear-armed countries and 4 other states in defense alliances with nuclear-armed states, exercise military strategies that involve the potential use of nuclear weapons in extreme circumstances or in retaliation for a nuclear attack. And so they also said, reflecting that reality in their statement, quote, our security policies are based on the understanding that nuclear weapons, for as long as they exist, should serve defensive purposes, deter aggression, and prevent war and coercion, unquote. So in other words, nuclear weapon states see their threats as defensive. They see the other guy's threats as irresponsible. And thus we see this tension between deterrence and disarmament, between deterrence and the international community's ability to deal with egregious threats of nuclear weapons use, as we saw from President Putin. So that's just a little editorial at the end to underscore that these issues are not always straightforward, and we need to dig in a little bit further to help people understand some of the nuances in the nuclear weapons debate.